Hello. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Carol Looper. I'm a member of CMC's board, and I'm a sort of semi-retired television reporter. I'm still a reporter, but I'm not on TV anymore. It's good to see everyone here today. Today, CMC's forum, The Reality of Trade and Tariffs, is brought to us with support from Dispatch Media Group. Please help me thank them. Good, bad, or indifferent, the topic of trade and tariffs creates lots of questions and unknowns for most of us. Will things cost more? Will jobs be lost or created? How could new rules affect cheese, tourism, or maple syrup? And one thing we do know, the market doesn't like uncertainty, which appears to be what we have the most of right now. So please welcome our experts today, economist and owner of Regionomics, Bill Lafayette, Vice President of Public Policy at the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, Yvonne Lasisco, and our host today, journalist at the Columbus Dispatch, Mark Williams, and a very special guest today, Consul General of Canada in Detroit, Douglas George. Mr. George will start us off with some opening remarks, and then Mark will lead the conversation. Mr. George?
Okay. Thank you, Carol. Bienvenue, mesdames et messieurs. Je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. And with your permission, I'll continue in English. First, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the board members of the Columbus Metropolitan Club for the opportunity to serve on this panel, which is very, very timely. And I'll get into the issue of NAFTA in a few minutes. As you've noted in my bio, I'm based in Detroit, and it's always an honor to have the opportunity to leave that state up north and visit the Buckeye State. I note the title of the panel is The Reality of Trade and Tariffs. And when it comes to matters as complex as international trade, I firmly believe that facts matter. To set the context for the panel, I'd like to share just a few key data points for you to consider. Every day, 400,000 people cross the Canada-U.S. border. Bilateral trades in goods and services was valued at $681 billion in 2017. And that means that $1.8 billion worth of goods and services cross the border each and every day. The magnitude of the Canada-U.S. relationship is so large it's difficult to overstate. The simple reality is that Canada and the U.S. have the longest, most peaceful, and mutually beneficial relationship of any two countries in the history of the world. And that is why Canada is strongly committed to moving forward with the U.S. on initiatives that keep our borders open to the flow of legitimate people and goods while securing our shared borders from shared threats. From the outset of the NAFTA renegotiations, and I think if you follow the news, you may have noticed there's a little bit of negotiating going on. We've been at this for about a year now, and from the very outset, Canada's aim was to modernize NAFTA. It's 24 years old. It's time to bring it up to date, include such concepts as weren't really in vogue 24 years ago, like e-commerce. 24 years ago, you said the word Amazon, people thought of a big river somewhere in South America. Now it's the biggest company in the world. So NAFTA doesn't cover that. But as you've seen in the news, Canada and the U.S. are engaged in intensive negotiations on NAFTA. In fact, the Canadian delegation arrived at the USTR at 11:23 today to continue these negotiations. We are making progress, but we're not there yet. And Canada has made it clear that we'll only agree to a deal that is good for Canada. Same as Mexico, same as Americans, each are looking for a deal that's good for your country. And we're confident that if we work together, we will come up with a win-win-win deal. This is possible. I'm not in a position to say much more at this time on the specifics of the negotiation, as the Canadian and U.S. negotiators wisely agreed not to negotiate in public. But I can tell you that Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland has confirmed that Ambassador Lighthizer and his team are negotiating in good faith, and together the two teams are making good progress. And our goal remains an improved NAFTA that it results in more jobs and economic growth for all three countries. We want the U.S. to succeed, we want Mexico to succeed, and of course we want Canada to succeed. This is a fact that the trilateral trade is essential to Ohio's economic well-being. This is why you should be listening to me. While Mexico is an important partner for Ohio, Canada is the largest customer for your exports. Last year, Ohio exported $18.9 billion to Canada and imported $12.2 billion from Canada. To put it more clearly, Ohio sells more to Canada than the next 7 largest foreign markets combined. So we are your biggest customer. If we look at investment, there are about 290 Canadian-owned firms located here, employing Ohioans, paying taxes, and making Ohio's communities such great places to live. And if you add trade and investment together, over 308,000 jobs in Ohio are tied to Canada. And if you want to look at that nationwide, 9 million jobs in the U.S. are tied to Canadian trade and investment. And as we move forward, Canada is prepared for all possible scenarios in these negotiations. But our preference is to work constructively with our American and Mexican partners to make North America more globally competitive. We are working together to compete against the rest of the world. Now, I've talked a bit about NAFTA. There's a separate issue, and I have to remind you this is separate, which are the tariffs on steel and aluminum. And this one has pretty serious implications for Ohio as well. The U.S. imposed Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada. Canada responded, and in a dollar-for-dollar response, Canada has imposed countermeasures on up to $12.8 billion worth of U.S. exports to Canada, imports into Canada. And these tariffs have real negative consequences. They're hurting our companies, our workers, and our consumers in both countries. Yes, I'm saying the tariffs that have been imposed are hurting both countries. So let me just give me a few moments, and I know I've got a limit here, so I won't bore you with many more economic facts, but here's an interesting one. The U.S. is running a $2 billion trade surplus in steel with Canada. And we, in fact, buy half of the steel that the U.S. exports to the whole world. We are your biggest customer on steel. But the U.S. has imposed these tariffs because of a national security justification. And it's an affront to Canadians that we would be considered a national security threat to the United States. Our two countries share a common defense base, and we have the longest non-militarized border in the world. We're staunch allies in NORAD and dependable partners in NATO. Canada is fundamental to U.S. national security. We fought side by side in 2 world wars, Korea, Afghanistan, and now we're fighting against ISIS together. So, as I said, we consider it absurd that these 232 tariffs have been applied to Canada. Let me talk a bit more about where we are in the world. North American products are competitive in the global market because we build things together, because we innovate together, and because we work together to find ways to keep costs down. That's why we are eager to achieve a positive resolution regarding these unjustified tariffs on steel and aluminum. That is why Canada supports free trade in the highly integrated automotive and vehicle parts sector. That is why we believe it's critical to modernize trade agreements like NAFTA. And that is why we are interested in building bridges between our two great nations, not barriers. Thank you for your kind attention. Merci beaucoup. I look forward to discussing these and other issues with the panel. And I will now turn it over to Mark Williams to moderate. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug, for kicking us off. That's really good stuff that we're going to start to work with right away for our discussion today. And thanks to the CMC for having me moderate the discussion today. Though I got to tell you, when I stand up here before you and talk about tariffs, I do feel a little like the economics teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. If you're like me, you've seen this movie a million times, and you know Ben Stein plays the teacher standing in front of the chalkboard talking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 and why the U.S. government adopted this legislation. You know, Stein is droning on and on. Kids are falling asleep in class, one kid drooling at his desk. Stein asks question after question in the class and keeps saying, anyone, in hopes that someone will answer. I'm assuming our conversation today will be a little bit more compelling than that. While it's funny to talk about that, there is an important point that Stein makes with his disinterested students about Smoot-Hawley, and that we'll be talking about today. At one point, he asked his students, did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank into a deeper depression. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about some tariff basics to start off with, and then get Bill and Yvonne in our conversation. So what's a tariff? Pretty simple. It's just basically a tax on goods that we import. Besides raising money for the government, tariffs are meant to protect our industries, as a common phrase that the president talks about, and employment from cheaper foreign goods. So let's say we have a 25% tariff on steel. That means if imported steel sells for $100 a ton, the price goes up to $125. Early on, tariffs were the key way we raised revenue in this country. And this is way before when we started paying income taxes. But since basically the end of World War II, the notion has been reduce our tariffs in other countries, reduce our tariffs as other countries have reduced theirs. Now our tariffs overall are very low, running less than 3%, though we get into areas where there can be much bigger ranges. This has worked well for the most part. We consumers pay less, and businesses pay less for the stuff that they need. But we all know that some of this trade has come with cost. Our apparel industry has been pretty much wiped out here in the United States for the most part. Companies have found it cheaper to make clothes and shoes overseas, for example. Our steel and aluminum industries, as Doug talked about, have been hurt by imports. We used to have a trade surplus once upon a time, meaning we exported more goods and services than we imported. Now we have huge deficits. And this has obviously been a big campaign by the president to talk about this stuff. His complaint, we're basically getting screwed by the entire world. The Mexicans, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Japanese, and most notably the Chinese. They're all taking advantage of us. We import far more than we export, and that's killing our industries and killing jobs. If we reduce these imports, we can bring these industries back to the U.S. and bring back the good-paying jobs that we lost. His complaint, we've been basically in a trade war for the last 20 years. We just didn't know it. And so anyway, so far, he hasn't had a whole lot of luck. The trade deficit numbers out today show that our trade deficit is running up 7% from 2017, and it was $50 billion just in July. Of course, whenever you talk about tariffs, there are winners and there's losers. Tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example, help our companies that make steel, but hurt automakers and appliance companies. Marion County, a prime example. We have a Nucor plant up there where their executives have long been pushing for tariffs. But there's also a Whirlpool plant in Marion that makes washers and dryers. Costs for aluminum and steel for those products have gone up dramatically. We just had an announcement today about appliance stores that have been raising prices on washers and dryers because of tariffs. My industry, God knows there's enough problems with it, but on top of those problems, we were hit by a devastating tariff on Canadian newsprint this year. The request for a tariff came from a hedge fund that owns a paper mill in Washington State that complained Canadian companies were selling newsprint at unfairly low prices. The tariffs were recently thrown out, but I'm afraid the damage is done. Newspapers all across the country have been reducing the number of pages they print and cutting back on staff, including reporters. So before you all start looking like Ben Stein, I want to get the others in our panel involved. Bill, let me kick it off with you. Does the president have a point, or are we taken advantage of by the entire world? And can it work? Can the tariffs that he wants to impose bring our industries back to the heyday that we once had?
Wow. Well, it is certainly true that there are cases when other countries take advantage of us. In some cases, countries engage in a practice called dumping, which is to sell goods below their cost as a means of cornering the market. Once the market is cornered, they can then raise prices. Lots of countries have quotas limiting the amount of specific goods that can be imported. So the government and not the market is driving the quantity of goods supplied. China especially has very high barriers to trade and foreign investment, big limitations on foreign investment, and very weak intellectual property protections. And China has been accused, and not just by Trump, of setting the value of its currency artificially low as a way of making its goods cheaper here in the U.S. and elsewhere in foreign markets, and foreign goods more expensive for Chinese consumers. The thing is, though, China eliminated the strict pegging of its currency back in 2005, and so the value of the currency has increased, and it hasn't had a clear impact on the balance of trade. So that argument that China manipulated its currency, thereby hurting the rest of the world, there's not a clear answer to that. But the point is that those policies hurt not just the countries that deal with China, but they hurt China itself and Chinese consumers.
So one of the issues that free traders talk about is that tariffs hurt consumers and our economy. Prices go up, companies have to charge more because it costs more to make things, and that causes inflations. Consumers don't have enough money, so they can't buy the stuff because it costs more. Add it all up, and you end up in a recession. Our most recent GDP number, though, was really strong. Atlanta Fed is saying that this quarter that we're in now is even going to be better. Why all the hand-wringing, Bill?
The economics community in general does not think that the rest of the year is going to be better than 4.2% that we got in the second quarter. That's partially a sugar hangover from the tax cut, but it's partly a response to the eventuality of tariffs. And here's how. More than a quarter of that 4.2% we got in the second quarter was due to a surge in exports.
In anticipation
That there would be tariffs. There are stories of ships that were coming from the Far East over to the U.S. speeding up so that they could get in to port before the tariffs hit. Sometimes they were successful, other times they weren't, and all of a sudden their goods were 24, 29% more expensive than they expected that they would be.
All right, Yvonne, let's get into it with tariffs and farmers. I can't imagine any other group in Ohio being more affected by tariffs than the folks that your group represents. We know, for example, that Ohio exports $700 million in ag products just to China. And of course, the tariffs that the Chinese have put on our soybeans have come at a difficult time when farm prices already are down. How are farmers holding up under all this? And as far as we go, sitting out here listening to you, how will that ultimately come back to us in terms of what we pay at the grocery store for food?
Sure, that's about 7 questions in one, so I appreciate
I know,
that.
yeah.
Thank you. So, absolutely. I mean, NAFTA and our NAFTA countries are our largest trading partners. China falls right there in terms of soybeans. So you've got, in terms of agriculture, you've got commodities across the board. You have both what we call your row crops, corn, beans, wheat. You've also got your livestock, hogs, cattle, dairy included in that. So each commodity is really being treated differently overall in terms of where they're pinpointing and where the counter tariffs are coming. And so from China, it definitely was against soybeans. We went from 3% to a 28% tariff, and they are our number one importer of our soybeans. And so that was a huge and dramatic hit. And so soybean farmers are feeling it really hard here, especially in Ohio. About a third of what we produce in Ohio in terms of soybeans goes out of the country, and it's mainly to China. And so it's a huge export crop for us. Some studies have been done that in the long term, if we continue to see those kind of tariffs coming from China, we could see a 59% decrease in farm income to our soybean farmers. That is significant. Imagine you seeing that kind of hit to your household income. It's not sustainable. And so, there's this measure that we can talk about at some point, but it's a aid package that's coming. It is a very welcome short-term package, still not even going to make our farmers whole in terms of what we're looking at in terms of the hit that they've received. But the markets have to be open, and we have to have that market. Let me quickly just speak to that question of what are we talking about in terms of the folks in this room. Most of you are probably not engaged in agriculture, but agriculture employs 1 out of 8 people in the state of Ohio. So, look around your table of 8. There is someone in that production chain from field to fork who's engaged in agriculture. In our rural economies, very truly, and in our economies overall, we are a major stimulus to the Ohio economy. And so if agriculture is not doing well, then we are not buying the new car at the dealership. We're not going to vote for that school levy. We are not going to give to the charity who's knocking at our door. And the insecurity of this entire thing, coupled with the already bad farm economy that we had, is going to have a ripple effect through the entire economy of Ohio.
And that's not necessarily one that is going to be solved when the tariff, assuming that the tariff goes away, because I have read that South American countries in particular are ramping up their production of soybeans. And so the Chinese are forging new relationships, new supply chains, and there's no compelling reason for them to dismantle those supply chains and go back to buying Ohio soybeans if the tariffs go down. The damage could be permanent.
Absolutely. That's the biggest fear.
So Yvonne, you just touched a quick second on the aid package that the president has proposed for farmers. What I've always read is that farmers want trade deals, not aid packages. Is this sort of a temporary thing to kind of get farmers through the rough spot? And if this goes on, obviously, and you're looking into 19. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's absolutely just a short-term solution. And even then, it is not actually making our farmers whole. So the package that's being delivered it's welcome, and obviously it's something that farmers need, especially with this huge sense of insecurity they have, but it is not going to take us through the long term. It is a short-term solution. It's about just the 2018 crop year. We'll have to wait and see kind of what productivity we have on our farms. For Ohio, it is corn, beans, and wheat, livestock being then pork and dairy. So those are the 5 entities that are affected here in the state of Ohio. The dollars are I don't want to say they're insignificant, but they do not reflect the true damage that's being done by the market.
Doug, on I'm confused on this issue of the North American Free Trade Act. We've had this deal in place with the Mexicans and the U.S. and the Canadians for some time now. And obviously the Mexicans have reached a deal with the U.S. The Canadians are negotiating one. Can our government even do that, or do we need to have all 3 countries together on a new deal?
Well, when it comes to interpreting U.S. law, I will leave that to the lawyers in the United States. I'm looking over at Dan. Let's keep in mind that NAFTA has been tremendously successful overall. Trade has more than tripled between our three countries. It's worth over $1 trillion a year in trade. We're the biggest free trade area in the world, and we've been successful. Now, we've been negotiating for over a year, and it's a very complex negotiation. There's 30-some chapters in NAFTA. Together, we made progress on, we closed a number of them, made progress on most of the rest, but there were a few important issues. One was automotive rules of origin, and the biggest difference was between the U.S. and Mexico, so they spent a lot of the summer working out their differences on automotive rules of origin. On the Canadian side, when we saw the results, the head of the biggest Canadian auto union thought that they were pretty good for Canadian workers, too. So they worked that out bilaterally. We're working out our bilateral issues last week and this week, and hopefully when we get that solved, all three countries will come back together to finalize the NAFTA. Canada said, someone asked our minister, what's the deadline? And she says, well, when Canada gets a good agreement, we'll sign. So that's our deadline, a good agreement for Canada.
I wanted to follow up with you on one thing, Doug. President Trump obviously is our Twitter-in-chief as well. And one of the things he said recently, this is one of his tweets from over the weekend, there is no political necessity to keep Canada in the new NAFTA deal. If we don't make a fair deal for the U.S. after decades of abuse, Canada will be out. When the president talks that way, what's your reaction to that?
Well, our foreign minister was asked a similar question, and she said her opposite number, her counterpart, is Ambassador Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, and he's negotiating in good faith, and they're making good progress with the team.
So you just handle it, stay away from it, huh?
He's a diplomat.
You're being diplomatic on the diplomatic side.
A diplomat never gets in trouble when quoting his foreign minister.
Understood. Wise advice. All right.
Well, the administration really seems to think that international trade is like the New York real estate market. It's a zero-sum game. Either I get this building and win, or you get this building and I lose. And it's not like that at all. You can forge relationships that make all parties better off.
Yvonne, despite the tariffs and all the issues that farmers face, all of our reporting shows that farmers still give great support to President Trump. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that?
Thank you. Appreciate the question. It's interesting. We've been asked multiple times, your farmers supported Trump in this election. By no means are farmers single-issue voters. They had a whole sundry of issues that were before them when they made those choices in the voting booths. And truthfully, both candidates were beating up TPP really hard. So if they were looking for the candidate that was going to charge forward with TPP, which was very good to us and actually renegotiated a lot of the stuff in NAFTA that we needed to have renegotiated in terms of some of those updates, then those farmers couldn't have found a candidate. So by number one, they're not a single issue candidate, single issue voter. Also, you don't always agree with your friends, and so I think that they also looked at the suite of other issues that they were deciding upon. I will say, though, that in this last round, our farmers have been very direct in communicating with the president, with the folks at United States Department of Agriculture, with our agricultural liaison at USTR to say, we can be patriots only so long, and we need a solution. And we've been very clear in saying we appreciate the aid, but we want trade. That message has been a very strong message that our farmers have been delivering to the Trump administration.
Bill, Doug touched on this in some of his comments as well. The president claims that there are issues of national security here. That's why we're wanting to put tariffs on aluminum and steel. And they say that our national security is threatened if we don't have these strong industries. Anything to that?
Well, I think the reasoning is that we need strong steel industry within the U.S. in order to ensure that we've got enough steel if war breaks out or something like that. So that's the argument. and there may be some validity to that in some cases. I wouldn't necessarily imagine that that's a thing with Canada. But trade is global. It really is. And global trade has myriad benefits to producers, to consumers, to the economy as a whole. And so if we have international trade, we're able to focus on the things that we're good at, and we're able to leverage technology. Other countries have ample low-cost labor. They can leverage that benefit. And so we all wind up better off.
We're getting close to time for Q&A, so please step over to the microphone. Don't be shy. But I do want to cover one more topic before we go to Q&A. And I think this question may be more directed to Bill, but I'd like to hear the others comment as well. Bill, let's live in La La Land, where there are no tariffs. There are no tariffs. No country manipulates its currency, and we all can trade freely back and forth with no restrictions whatsoever. In that case, would the U.S. still import more than we export? Would we still run trade deficits?
Probably, simply because the trade deficit and the national savings rate are inversely related. If you want to cut the deficit, you have to raise the savings rate. We don't seem to have a stomach to do that. The higher interest rates that are in the offing will help a little bit. But in general, again, it's a question of the person or the country that's best at doing X does X. The country that's best at doing Y does Y. We focus on what we're good at.
Okay, so
Can I say to that?
Sure,
The
Yvonne.
country that's doing the best at X being agriculture, is us.
Absolutely.
Sure.
We enjoy feeding all of you, and as a matter of fact, we enjoy feeding the world.
Yes.
Yes.
And so we are actually on the surplus side of that house.
Yeah, right.
So agriculture, if you look at it as its own unique silo, we are a surplus country. I mean, so our U.S. agricultural exports in 2016 were $130 billion, and our imports were $113 billion. So we fortunately fall on the side of the fact that, based on our productivity and how good we have become at actually growing the food at a reasonable rate and being able to export it and having the proper infrastructure, we're fortunate in the fact that we're on the surplus side of the house.
yeah, and Doug, obviously,
I think you can say that Canada-U.S. trade, apart from 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum and the countermeasures, is already basically in La La Land,
Right.
because we have 100% of our industrial trade is at zero tariffs. Well over 99% of our agricultural trade is at zero tariffs. We're working hard to harmonize regulations and to remove barriers to trade. And, we're trying to make it a much more efficient trading system. So I think if we can safely and satisfactorily come up with a NAFTA 2.0, or whatever it may be called, I'm not tied to any particular name, we'll get closer to the La La Land you envision.
yeah.
And I would just say on agriculture, while China is a very important agricultural market for Ohio, you send twice as much to Canada as you sell to China.
And greater trade interdependence reduces the risk of war.
Well, and I think wasn't that the
That-
philosophy of one of the reasons after World War II?
Yeah.
When you started seeing tariff reductions come into place, noting that if countries became more interdependent, that would lead to better relationships
Yeah.
and less likelihood of evil things happening.
Sure. Yeah, money's important.
Indeed.
That's an economic
Indeed, that's your
comment.
economic lesson for the day. Of course, it is the CMC tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question. Let's get started with the first question.
Hi, I'm Amanda Sage with the Metropolitan Club. My first question is, in light of burning bridges, or at least greatly angering our traditional trade partners, is there going to be some spoiler country that comes in and swoops in and beats the U.S. out, or becomes our new partner that we're not expecting? Does that make sense?
Certainly could be. For example, Brazil, as I said, is growing soybeans now. They could, to a certain extent, eat our lunch. Harley-Davidson moved some of its production over to Europe to take advantage of that market. It's not costless to change your supply chains, your production. There's no compelling reason for them to change back once the tariffs go away.
So what we have seen in the automotive industry is that the three countries have become heavily connected.
Yeah.
Parts move back and forth on a regular basis. The cost of shipping, from what I understand, has gotten so low that it makes it really easy to move things back and across the border. It seems to me that I think one of the issues of the question is that it's just easy to move it someplace else. And then I think even if you restore it, I think you run the risk of the damage being done for good.
Right.
And you can't get it back.
Right.
So.
And on the other side of that house is what new markets do we have? And so part of the aid package was more money for new markets, but agriculture and Canada is our #1 trading partner in terms of agriculture. What we would have to do to open a market that even begins to look like the number of dollars we have, I don't even know where those humans would come from.
Yeah, certainly you want to do that, but why would you go up and screw up a good thing?
Exactly.
Yeah. Next question.
Jamie Sisto. I'm a member of a national organization that advises the U.S. Department of Commerce on trade policy. It's called the District Export Council, and we've come down firmly against increasing tariffs. Just to give you the perspective of where I'm coming from. Consul General, there are, and excuse the term, sacred cows in every society, and in Canada it's dairy. In the United States, maybe it's pickup trucks, which we've protected since the 1960s because of a chicken war with the European Union. Are there sacred cows in this negotiation that Canada won't allow to be touched? And to Bill, I agree with your observations completely. My question to you is, and I think we discussed this once before, every time we have a high trade deficit, we have low unemployment. So are we not just a consumer society that if we're demanding more than we can produce, then we buy more, and that comes from overseas? So is a trade deficit a bad thing?
You want to start?
Talk about sacred cows?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's clear that one of the sensitivities in Canada is our supply management system, which has been in place for over 50 years and means that our dairy and other farmers have greater certainty on demand so they can plan supply. And the U.S. administration has said they want changes. That's for the negotiators to work out. And as I said, we're not negotiating in public, although our prime minister's made very clear we will protect Canada's interest in this area. U.S. has its own sensitive issues, and I won't get into those. And in any trade negotiation, there will be issues like that. The U.S. has certain tariffs on dairy products over a certain volume that approach or exceed the Canadian tariffs, but this is not part of our debate. And when you look at surplus and deficit, that's not the best measure of whether trade is successful or not, but I would note that the U.S. is running a trade and services surplus with Canada and continues to run it. We talked about decreasing exports. Well, exports recently to Canada have increased by $16 billion. So it's an area that we basically have balanced trade with the U.S. The U.S. runs a surplus in virtually every category except for one, and that's energy. And Canada is, and you might think this, you may not believe this, Canada is the largest supplier of all forms of energy to the U.S. We're your largest supplier of oil, natural gas, electricity. We're also your largest supplier of cold weather, which means that you have to buy more oil, gas, and electricity. Funny how that works. Yeah.
As far as trade deficits being a good or a bad thing, jury's out on that. I will say that Jamie's quite correct that there's a relationship between trade deficits and the strength of the economy. It simply runs from the strength of the economy to the trade deficit because household consumption is 71% of U.S. GDP, and so as the economy gets stronger, household consumption goes up. It was responsible for 2.6% of our 4.2% GDP gain last quarter. Then yes, we're going to be buying more from other countries, especially if we're strong relative to the economies of other countries. Personally, I don't think that the trade deficit is as big a problem as others do. A lot of people point to the idea of the outsourcing of labor, moving production to other countries as a negative of global trade. But the fact of the matter is that if we look at all the jobs in manufacturing that have been lost over the past, say, 30 years, only something like 15% of those jobs have been lost because of global outsourcing. The rest of those jobs have been lost because of automation. And they would have been lost had we had a global trade presence or not.
Yeah, so certainly you saw the trade deficit shrink dramatically coming out of the last recession.
Yeah.
And to the question, or to the point of the question, was that now that the economy is running well, we're going to see that trade deficit widen as we consume more.
Sure. And save less.
And that's the other factor too. We, as you noted before, Bill, we don't save enough money.
Right.
And the Chinese, for example, I think I read someplace where they save half their income because they don't have the social safety net that we have in the U.S.
Yeah.
So they need to save more to be prepared. But even us, compared to some other countries, we still don't save as much as what we should.
Right.
So, all right, next question.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. I work for Rife's Auto Body. As a consumer and as a business manager, I only have so much money to spend on whatever it is that I need to purchase. When the cost of those goods and services go up, I have to buy less of them, or I have to find another place to buy them less expensively. And I'm just having a hard time getting my mind around the tariffs. It seems as though if we tax as a country a product, a good that we're producing, it's only going to benefit us short term because the buyer only has so much money to spend, just like I only have so much money to spend. They're going to find a way to get by with less or to buy it elsewhere. So it seems like the tariffs just produce a temporary and false economy. So I feel like I'm missing something. There's a disconnect somewhere. I don't get where they provide a long-term solution. Am I missing something?
No, I don't really think so.
Thank you.
A 25% tariff on steel, admittedly, is going to be helpful to steel producers, who will, by the way, be able to raise their prices too because the supply is being constrained artificially by this tariff. But when you look at the broader economy, it certainly hurts consumers. What was that, Mark? The price of washers and dryers went up
Yeah, we had,
20% in a 3-month period?
Yeah, this was the consumer, J.D. Malone, who's sitting here at the table. We did a story on tariffs, it's been a couple months ago, and one of the things we noted that there was some inflation data which showed that the inflation on washers and dryers was 20% over a 3-month period, and that was all tied to tariffs. And so, that's, I'm assuming we'll see prices of cars go up, and other kinds of appliances, refrigerators, and everything else that people need to have. We've put prices on aluminum that people need to build their homes. The price of I believe Doug helped me out. I think we have tariffs now on softwood lumber that we import from Canada. That also go into the price. They also go into building homes. All that adds up to the cost of building a house.
Yeah, and it's the producers that use basic metals who are going to get hurt. And let me trot this out for you. In the Columbus MSA, we have 1,500 workers right now in basic metals, but we have 7,600 workers in fabricated metals who are buying this stuff at a higher price, 7,000 in machinery, and 14,000 in automotive parts and other transportation equipment manufacturing. They're all going to get hurt, and there may be layoffs there. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and on the other side of it, you see, I don't know how familiar all of you are with the old Wheeling Pit plant that used to be in Mingo Junction, all the way on the eastern line with West Virginia. This was a powerhouse steel company way back in the day, but like everything else along that part of the state, really got hit with all kinds of problems, and eventually closed, and then it reopened, and it's been sold several times. Now we have a new Indian buyer that is coming in and wants to take over the plant and is promising lots of things, and that is a situation where you're going to get some support from tariffs that they think will help in the long term because it will provide a floor for steel prices. But it is, again, I can go back to my newsprint example of one company benefiting from tariffs on Canadian newsprint while the entire newspaper industry gets whacked.
Right.
So,
Hard.
Anyway, next question.
My name is Sean Lyons. I'm with Carlisle, Patchen, and Murphy. And my question, as you mentioned, as the Consul General mentioned, the NAFTA agreement was signed when the Amazon was just a river. And nowadays, we're looking at, I think the Director of National Intelligence a couple years ago said about $40 billion is lost by the United States each year in intellectual property theft and cybersecurity losses. And a lot of that occurs not just by stealing from a U.S. firm, but by stealing from a U.S. firm that's partnered with a Canadian firm or a Mexican firm or something along those lines. And there's been some debate. The president does have this power under the National Security Act to levy a tariff, but whether cybersecurity is really a good reason to be levying tariffs against firms and trying to keep certain businesses homegrown. And I guess I'm wondering if the Consul General would agree with that, that maybe this is really meant for a kind of a different agreement than NAFTA.
Well, I happen to be Canada's intellectual property negotiator for 5 years, so I know a little bit about it. It is a problem worldwide, and and when I was doing it for those years, most of our focus on the U.S. was cooperating on dealing with common problems. If there was a shipment of fake something or other, extension cords or batteries that showed up in the U.S. at a port in the U.S. and got stopped, what we would see is the next shipment would go either down to Mexico or up to Vancouver. So we would cooperate to make sure that we were aware of the threats and working together to find solutions. And in international forums like the WTO, WIPO, NAFTA, and bilaterally, we had a very strong process of working together to find common solutions, because a threat to the U.S. is usually a threat to Canada, and we need to work together and be cooperative to find solutions. So that was our approach. Now, on occasion, we have differences of views on certain aspects of intellectual property, but that's more a rarity than the general approach of very similar approaches, very similar laws, and a high degree of cooperation among our enforcement and other agencies.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Two more questions, I'm told.
Jane Scott, Columbus Metropolitan Club. It's my understanding that whatever is negotiated that replaces NAFTA, or whatever we're going to call it, that ultimately has to be approved by Congress. So I have at least a little bit of confidence that the final deal is going to get pounded out and will be fine for Canada and U.S. and Mexico. My concern is, how much is all of this nasty rhetoric going to impact our trading partners all over the world that might feel that the United States is not playing nice in the sandbox, or potentially is uncertain and uncertain trading partner, particularly in food, Yvonne. We saw it in Jimmy Carter's time when we did a trade embargo with Russia, and it basically tanked the whole ag industries for 10, 15 years before our trading partners came back and created the Brazil soybean industry that wasn't there before. So I'm concerned about the uncertainty that this whole process is creating in the market, not the actual deal itself.
I can speak to agriculture first, and then obviously we'll let you speak to Canada. Jane, you're absolutely right. And part of our frustration is the fact that agriculture a lot of times is the first entree into a market. Farmers with their own dollars are the ones who are entering brand new markets, because it's what developing nations need. So we send trade envoys constantly to foreign countries to open those markets, to talk about new products, to talk about new technologies especially. Some of them are hesitant about those too. And so there has been a lot of work done by the agriculture community with their own dime to enter and grow these markets. And so it is very frustrating when then there becomes a sense of, is that trading partner frustrated with us now? Do they not trust us? Are they upset about the rhetoric that came along with it? And so we continue to actually continue with those discussions. Some of our counterparts in some of the commodity groups were just in China continuing to have the discussions, and they had folks over here who we met with last week to have those discussions. So we're continuing, regardless of what's happening in terms of the discussions with our governments. We as farmers are continuing to try to have those very open discussions. We met this morning, and so we continue to have those discussions so that everybody understands we want to be in your markets, and when we are on the other side of this, we hope that that still exists.
Yeah, I'll make it simple. The reason we have trade agreements is to provide a certain level of certainty so that businesses are willing to take the risk of going to other markets. And the better the trade agreement, the better the certainty. A large part of my job when I'm not talking about NAFTA is working with my team to help grow Canadian sales and investment. And for a lot of Canadian companies, the first place they will try to export is to Ohio, to that state up north, nearby, where we speak the same language, we have similar laws. And then when they get experience, then they'll branch farther afield and grow their exports. And I'm sure a lot of it is the same for U.S. companies. First place they try and export is Canada, get some experience under their belt and keep going. So I think once we come up with a solution, we will have a lot of opportunity ahead of us to continue to grow, because I think we've seen how well NAFTA has helped already, and if we can update it, I think it'll be a great opportunity for the whole continent. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're done, and we're going to turn it back over to Carol.
I want to thank all of the speakers. I hope you all found today's forum enlightening. I don't know if we were looking for hope or certainty. I don't know that we got any certainty, but we certainly were enlightened. Let's thank the Columbus Dispatch again for their support. And let's thank our speakers, Bill Lafayette, Yvonne Lasico, Mark Williams, and our special guest, Consul General of Canada in Detroit, Douglas George. And thanks again to all of you for being here. I hope to see you next week at CMC.